to Biblical Psychology, the channel that combines psychological ideas with scripture to help you respond more effectively to the promises in the Bible with regards to mental health. And if this is the first time that you're joining us, I think it's a good episode for you to join in on, because today we're going to be looking at Transdiagnostic Reflections. And what I mean by that is that for the first 23 episodes or so, we've been looking at diagnostic conditions, and I thought that I would conclude that season of episodes by looking at what's common across diagnoses. And for those of you who have been tuning in on a weekly basis, you would see that I had been drawing on different diagnoses to help explain different presentations. And the reason for that is because in our society we have nomenclature which is detailed in DSM-5 to describe different presentations. But psychological research has actually found that in spite of how a person is diagnosed, there are common themes that present themselves in individual lives across the diagnoses. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. And then we're going to have a look at some scriptures to highlight what the Bible talks about with regards to our emotion. So in reflecting on the different diagnoses, what we see there is that it's essentially a presentation of negative emotion, and people express negative emotion in different ways. So in the previous episodes that we've been looking at, one theme that is very apparent across diagnosis is the experience of psychological trauma. And you might be interested to know that research shows that 95% of individuals who present to mental health services have a history of psychological trauma. So this begs the question, are we dealing with a diagnosis or are we dealing with psychological trauma? And the psychological research would infer that we are actually dealing with psychological trauma rather than a psychiatric condition. And if we're dealing with trauma, then it would be prudent of services to offer psychological informed mental health care. And I have to say that it's been my observation that mental health services in England are catching up with the research and are working towards providing more trauma-informed mental health care. And why might that be important? Well, I believe that if we target the actual problem, it makes for more efficient and effective delivery of psychological treatment. And another theme that was evident in the episodes that I presented was that the psychological framework that I used to help explain the different presentations. So you may remember that the framework that I used was the cognitive behavior framework. And this is an approach that helps to explain mental health from a psychological perspective. And what it essentially postulates is that faulty thinking can affect our emotional state, which will then lead us to behave in negative ways, or our behavioral expression constitutes what might be called the mental health problem. And people might express sort of mental ill health in lots of different ways, and this, I believe, has been the basis of DSM-5, which is you'll see that come up on the screen, which is a manual that is used in mental health services to make diagnosis of different presentations. But are these presentations really different? That would be my question. And why is it that if we're dealing with psychological trauma, that people do present quite differently in their mental ill health? Well, a colleague of mine by the name of Isabel Clark has written quite a lot on this, and I just like to draw on a paper that she's written. You'll see the title of it come up on the screen. Coping Mechanisms, Strategies and Outcomes. So in her paper, what she's suggesting is that the different behavioral expressions that we refer to as mental ill health or psychiatric conditions reflect the individual's strategy of coping with adverse circumstances. So I'd just like to read a section of her paper which I think eloquently describes the position that she's making. When mental health breaks down, it is often, but not always, in response to adverse life events. Such events constitute a rupture in that fabric of roles and relationships that sustain good functioning. At such times, the human being grasps at ways of coping with the crisis. The immediate goal of such coping is generally to find a way to escape from the intolerable affect. The intolerable affect is a consequence of the loss of or disruption to the defining roles and relationships referred to above. Such loss reveals the limitations of our apparently self-sufficient individuality. The operation of our complex brains entails a constant interaction between the verbal, logical part that gives us our seeming sense of individuality and the older body and emotion-based systems that govern our relationships. The result is that a simple event such as the loss of a job or a partner can open a chasm in an individual's sense of self that leaves them floundering and grasping at the nearest means of psychological survival they can grasp into. Subjectively, this is experienced as overwhelming emotion, whether fear because all assurance of safety has vanished, or other loss emotions such as anger and pain. For another person, approaching adulthood with an already fragile sense of individual self, simple life transitions such as leaving home can have the same effect. For women, giving birth is another of these potentially liminal events that can disrupt the flow of normal life and plunge the individual into unknown territory and has to be coped with. So loss of vital roles or relationships or transitional events for the vulnerable disrupt the sense of self and can expose the individual to a deep sense of unacceptability in relation to the social reference group, to overwhelming feelings of rejection, failure, and intolerable psychic pain and or anger. As already indicated, human beings have a variety of ways of coping with disruption to their sense of inner and outer security. The chosen coping mechanisms are varied and imaginative, and familiar to those working in mental health as symptoms of mental illness. The most straightforward reaction to the crisis is to withdraw, shut down physically, and cease to compete. In other words, depression. Anxiety can be kept on the boil without being fully faced through constant worry and displaced panic. Street drugs and alcohol provide a straightforward way out, and for high schizotypes, there is the option of shifting into another psychotic dimension. Obsessive compulsive disorder and eating disorders can be seen in terms of substituting a seemingly controllable agenda, such as weight or absolute cleanliness, for the threatening uncontrollability of the real world. So I think that was elegantly put in helping us to understand how individuals develop different dysfunctional coping styles to deal with a traumatic situation or overwhelming affect or emotion. And from a biblical perspective, God knows our makeup, and he knows that as individuals we do become prone to becoming overwhelmed in very challenging circumstances. And I believe that's one of the reasons why God encourages us to use spiritual means to deal with difficult and challenging circumstances. And one of these spiritual interventions is to simply rely on the strength of God whenever we're going through very challenging times, and to remind ourselves of the promises that God makes to us, of how he will enable us to cope when we're going through very difficult times. So I've selected a few verses from the Bible to help us understand the provision that God himself has made to us when life becomes very threatening and difficult. So the first is taken from Psalm 46, verse 1 and 2, and that states, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in times of trouble. Therefore, I will not fear. And that's just such a lovely and comforting verse for us to draw on if we are going through very challenging times. So we can remind ourselves of that promise that says that in our very difficult experiences, God will show up, that he will make provision for us to cope. And if we look at John 16, verse 33, it states, so this is Jesus speaking, and it was before he was crucified. And I find that so amazing because it was, I'm not sure the time span, but when you read that passage and the following chapters, you see that soon after Jesus was to be crucified. And in spite of knowing that he was going to be crucified, he even had comforting words to give to his disciples. And there Jesus says, "These things I have spoken unto you, that in me you might have peace. In the world you will have tribulation or calamities. But be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world. And there's probably a lot of meaning in that verse to unpack, which we don't have time to do. But essentially, Jesus was encouraging his disciples that in spite of any tribulation or calamities that they may experience, they are to maintain their cheerfulness, because he has made a way for them to overcome it. And now just going on to Psalm 91. Now the whole of that psalm is relevant, and we'll show it all on the screen, but we haven't got time for me to read the whole chapter. But just going to focus on verses 14 to 16, where it states, "Because he has set his love on me, therefore I will deliver him. I will set him on high because he has known my name. He shall call upon me and I will answer him. I will be with him in trouble. I will deliver him and honor him. With long life I will satisfy him and show him my salvation." So we see there that what the Lord is saying is that because we set our love on him, he will deliver us, and he will do. He will keep us safe. He will bless us with long life, and show us his salvation. And it's quite amazing to read all of those verses, because what it's essentially saying is that in spite of our difficulties and challenges and stresses and traumas, we are to maintain a constant state of positive emotion. And that can only occur if we focus on God and the promises that he makes to us. And interestingly, there is a field within psychology called positive psychology, which has researched the benefits to our psychological well-being when we do focus on positive emotion. And so that's going to form the next season or theme for our episodes across the next several weeks. And so the next episode will be on positive psychology. And so that's all that I will be talking on today. And I hope that there may have been some nugget of information that you found useful that can assist you on your journey to recovery. And don't forget to subscribe, because that way you'll be notified of all the future episodes coming up. Bye-bye.